All right, so when we left off, Sullivan had lost his case against New York Times, and in particular, the Supreme Court had delineated the difference between a public figure and a private figure, and noted that a public figure had much less protection against defamation because a public figure should expect to be the subject of free speech, some of which might be negative. So this is the idea that they are fair game for any attacks, whether false or not. Now, there is a narrow exception to that, and the exception has to do with being able to prove actual malice. You have to prove that they, with malicious intent, printed something that was untrue that harmed you. And that, particularly for a newspaper, is very hard to prove. Because a newspaper, again, Mr. Catch hopefully will have a chance to tell you, while there may be individuals in the newspaper itself that may have personal views on one side or the other, and might even have an emotional state's negative enough that might qualify as malice at a personal level, the institution of a newspaper doesn't have malice for the most part. Most of the time they're printing news because they think it's newsworthy. And as I said, hopefully Mr. Cash can comment further on that. But it's actually a pretty difficult standard. Proving actual malice turns out to be very, very difficult. They have to show that they intended to harm, and it was not for any compelling public reason. Okay? So that's kind of the backdrop we were talking about in terms of free speech. Now, what about the First Amendment, which is for free speech? Any charge of defamation hurts freedom of speech, and this is the tension that we're talking about. This is the tension courts are very reluctant to weigh against freedom of speech in this situation by allowing defamation to essentially squash people's motivation and ability to speak defamation about someone else. So, in this regard, courts are very reluctant to do anything that will chill free speech, particularly for private people. Private individuals have a great many rights, but being defamed in a public arena is one of those exceptions, right? There are limitations to free speech, and we'll talk about some of them going forward. But one of them is you can't harm someone else, and for the most part, that certainly applies if the person you are attempting to harm with public information that defames you is a private person. That is to say, someone who doesn't hold themselves out to be a public figure. But if you hold yourself out to be a public figure, if you essentially hold yourself to the public eye as a public figure, and certainly in the case that we're going to be talking about, Johnny Depp and Amber Heard qualify, you have the least amount of protection. You're in the public eye because you want to be. You're holding yourself out to be a public figure, so you expect, or you should expect, that you will be the target of speech, free speech, some of which might be negative, and some of which might be false. But as long as you can't show actual malice, you can't prevent someone else from saying something about you that is bad, particularly if you're a public figure. All right? So that's an important distinction to make, particularly in the case that we're talking about here. All right? So what do you have to prove? And we talked a little bit about this when we talked about the opening statements. But you have to have a false statement. It has to be published by someone other than the object of the statement. And if it involves a public figure, that public figure, in order to make a successful case of defamation, has to show actual malice, and there has to be actual damage. These actual damage could be loss of a job, loss of a West Point appointment, or a Naval Academy appointment, or any other special damages that include emotional harm that the person who published the material would have reason to know of. Okay, emotional harm that can be measured. In general, the emotional harm that doesn't lead to you seeing a psychiatrist and therefore having bills to prove, it has to be an emotional harm that you can show led to monetary damages to you. Okay, so that's the things that we're talking about. So if we bring this to our present case, what does Depp have to show? First, it has to show that the statement made, to the extent that there is an implication that Depp is the person who abused Heard, and again, you'll have read the op-ed piece, and if you hadn't read it, it's actually read in the full statement is read during the opening argument of Ms. Heard's counsel. So, to the extent that and correctly so, one of the things that Heard's counsel does say is they never identify who the abusive spouse is. Johnny Depp's counsel in return is probably correct in saying that there's a lot of evidence to suggest that it's Depp. And I would say even more so, there's a fair amount of evidence to suggest it's publicly known that she was referring to Depp. But so let's assume that threshold's met, that she's talking about Depp. What he has to prove is that the statement she made was false. Okay. Number two is relatively easy for him to show because it was published as an op-ed, but that she made a statement in the op-ed and that it was false. Okay. Those two things he has to prove, and that it was made with actual malice. Okay. And the fourth thing, which in some cases is trivial because measuring damage is easy, but I think in this case it's not trivial, he has to show that it damaged him. Okay. And that's actually going to go to the crux of what I'm going to ask you at the end of this little mini lecture. Okay. All right. So those are the things that Depp has to prove. Amber Heard also has a counterclaim against Depp, which essentially has the same elements, in that the statements that he has made or through counsel has made have been false against her, that they've been published publicly in court proceedings, and as well as pleadings, and that they were made with actual malice, and they've caused damage to her reputation. I would suspect her case is easier in some respects, but much, much harder in others. In particular, I think the actual damages we'll talk about. Okay, but both of them have cases that are difficult for a variety of reasons. All right. So one of the things to think about is, how did courts apply this public-private person distinction when deciding defamation? Okay. Well, in terms of who is a public figure, first of all, any famous celebrity pretty much qualifies as a public figure. Any public figure who holds themselves out to be a public figure in the context of like a U.S. senator, a president, a congressman, right? Where it can be more problematic situations where someone is not often in the public eye or doesn't often hold themselves as public figures. Okay, family members are not of celebrities, or family members of politicians are not automatically held to be public persons unless they hold themselves out to be. So, for example, the prior President Obama's daughters, I think, would be difficult to show that they are meant to be, they hold themselves out to be public figures. I think it would be difficult for you to even argue that at least those members of President Trump's family who were part of his administration, I think it's very hard to argue that they weren't public figures, simply because it was pretty clear they're holding themselves out to be public figures, with the exception of Barron. So it's important to understand that the family of someone who is a public figure isn't necessarily a public figure unless they engage in behavior that suggests they are trying to become one. Okay. Now, civil servants, teachers, first responders, school board members, right? Even judges who don't necessarily hold themselves out as public figures, but whose hearings are televised, that can sometimes be a little bit more problematic to engage in, and courts have had to be somewhat careful. Okay, so the Gert Welch case is a good example for someone. He's an attorney working on a high-profile murder trial. Okay, and Gertz, it was not considered, even though Gertz had gained some public attention, he wasn't holding himself out to be a public figure. Okay, in and of itself, just being involved in a case that ended up being sort of hyped or being reported on a lot by newspapers doesn't make you a public figure. Okay. Now, if as the attorney you held press conferences every day and then published a book, that would be a situation that might lead to you going from a private figure to a public figure. Okay. All right. So let's get to this aspect of malice, because this is an interesting concept. So Megaphone has to show, the senator has to show, in order to sue Megaphone, that Megaphone published something that was wrong, which in this case, because we set the facts up, is clearly true. True in the sense that the photograph of the senator kissing someone not their spouse is wrong. It was a phony photo. But how does she prove that Megaphone actually published it with actual malice? Okay. There are two ways to prove actual malice. Either the person publishing the photo knows it isn't true, is one way. Okay. In the Depp case, we were talking about this idea that Amber Heard, for Depp to make his case, he has to show that Amber Heard wrote the op-ed knowing it was false. Okay? And that's key. An opinion isn't either true or false. An opinion is a viewpoint based on perspective. So it's important to understand that simply her having the opinion it was true doesn't make it true, but it also doesn't him having the opinion that's contrary to that doesn't make it false. That's simply a difference of opinion. So he has to prove actual malice. They knew it wasn't true. Okay, and you heard from his counsel in their opening statement pretty clearly what their take is on it, because they have to prove it. So they asserted it right away that she's lying, it never happened, so forth and so on. Okay, the other option is that Heard recklessly disregarded the truth if she was the one who printed it. But in this case, since she's the one who was the source of the op-ed, they actually have to prove that she knew it wasn't true. Okay, they could be suing the Washington Post, and in that case, the standard might be reckless disregard of the truth, which gets back to hopefully Mr. Catch's experience on what papers do to engage in their due diligence to make sure that they aren't recklessly disregarding the truth. Right? They try and print what is true. Okay. So it's a pretty high standard. All right. So what does it mean to show actual malice? What kind of standard are we talking about? So Hart-Hanks, you have someone who's running for an open judicial seat, and Hart-Hanks Communication printed a story that accused them of bribing a grand jury witness, essentially engaging in a criminal act, felony, in fact. The court said since the newspaper had not talked to a key witness regarding the bribes, nor listened to tapes that might actually show it didn't happen, they'd acted with what's called reckless disregard for the truth when publishing the article. They had not engaged in what a modern journalist I suspect would call, or at least in most professions we call, due diligence, to make certain that what they were printing had enough evidence to suggest to a reasonable person that it was true. Okay, so even a public figure can prevail in a defamation case as long as they can show what we call actual malice in this context, which means this notion that either they knew it wasn't true, which is the case against Amber Heard, or they didn't engage in enough due diligence to make sure it was true, which would be Megaphone in this case, or the Washington Post, if Depp was really interested in suing the Washington Post, which, well, we'll see how that goes. All right. Okay, so Fran loses, and to go back to our earlier hypothetical, Fran loses because the photo that Sandy published of him was true. So that's an absolute truth. Okay. The senator is suing for what's called a false statement. And it is a false statement, right? Because the picture itself shows her was a phony doctored photo, but it was published and she can go damages. But she has to show, if she wants to sue Megaphone, that there was actual malice. So did they know it was false, or did they post it in reckless disregard for the truth? So the key is, did Megaphone publish this in reckless disregard for the truth by not trying to corroborate the photo? All right, and as I said, hopefully Mr. Catch can talk to you a little more about what kinds of things, to what lengths journalists go to, which is actually pretty far, to make sure that they're not publishing things that aren't true. They don't just publish anything that comes across, at least not respected journalists and respected news media. They do not want to be sued successfully, and they don't want to be. And again, Mr. Koch can comment on this more. They also believe it really is their duty, their professional duty, in the same way that we attorneys really should be engaging in justice. Journalists should be engaging in truth. They're both part of the same system, and without truth, the function of the media's eyes and ears of the public really is suspect. Which gets me to my question. What I'd like you guys to research here, okay? And this lesson summary is found in the study.com, which I assigned. But the question I want you guys to answer now, and you do a little bit of research on this. In particular, I'd like you to address what the opening argument of Johnny Depp's counsel made, which is that he's been damaged by this, okay? We'll get to the whether or not you think Amber Heard's telling the truth as she believes it or understands it, because that would also be a defense, because then she's not saying something she knows to be false, which is a standard for her. But one of the things they also have to prove is this actually has damaged him. So Amber Heard's counsel in opening argument said that his damages are all self-inflicted. Any damage his career has is because of him. Is that true? Did this op-ed piece damage him? That's what I'd like you guys to research about. In groups, come up with some presentations and tell me what you think. I'm very interested to see what you come up with. All right? Take care.